The loan officer slid my denied mortgage application across the mahogany desk and told me a massive new debt had just hit my file, destroying my debt-to-income ratio overnight. I drove straight to my parents' house in Connecticut, only to find a brand new white Porsche parked in their driveway with a giant red velvet bow on the hood. My mother casually sipped her wine and admitted they used my social security number to finance an $80,000 wedding gift for my younger sister. What they did not know was that as a senior auditor, I track financial fraud and calculate risk for a living. They assumed I was just a quiet daughter they could exploit, but they had just handed me the exact paper trail I needed to dismantle their fake empire. By forging my digital signature on that auto loan, they walked directly into a federal trap of their own making. My name is Evelyn. I'm 29 years old, and I just took back my life. Before I continue this story, let me know your local time and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to Sweet Life Drama if you have ever had your own blood relative steal your hard work to fund their lifestyle. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I turned my sister's luxury wedding into a criminal investigation. I left the bank and sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. 30 minutes prior, I had been excitedly picking out paint swatches for a 2-bedroom condo in New Haven. Sage green for the living room, warm white for the kitchen. Now my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the credit report. A loan I never signed had just ruined my debt-to-income ratio and killed my mortgage approval on the spot. I looked down at the paint swatches in my hand. I squeezed my fist until the thick paper crumpled and tore, pressing sharply into my palm. My chest felt hollow, like the air had been violently sucked out of the cabin. The people who were supposed to protect me had just sold my sanctuary to buy a luxury car. I felt the hot sting of tears welling up in my eyes. A messy sob clawed at my throat. But crying is a biological response to pain, and an auditor cannot afford pain when the ledger is bleeding. I took a slow, jagged breath and forced the heartbreak down into a tight, dark box. I flattened the ruined paint swatches on my lap. The panic vanished, replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. I put the car in drive, merged onto the interstate, and headed straight to the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, where my parents lived in a pristine colonial house with manicured hedges. I turned onto their street and hit the brakes. The driveway was currently occupied by a gleaming white Porsche Macan. A comically large red bow rested on the windshield. My younger sister Chloe stood next to the driver's side door, holding her phone high to capture the perfect selfie. She wore a designer sundress she definitely could not afford on her part-time boutique salary. Standing a few feet away was David, her fiancé. David was a brilliant cardiothoracic surgeon from a prominent Black family in Boston. His parents sat on hospital boards and funded university wings. My parents treated his arrival into our family like a winning lottery ticket, and they spent the last year bending over backward to prove they belonged in his social circle. I slammed my car door shut and walked past the Porsche without looking at Chloe. I pushed through the front door and marched straight into the kitchen. My mother Susan stood by the marble island, swirling a glass of Chardonnay. My father Richard sat at the head of the dining table, reviewing a country club newsletter. I threw the crumpled credit report onto the counter next to my mother's wine bottle. I asked them why my name was on a luxury vehicle parked outside. Susan did not drop her glass. She did not gasp or apologize. She took a slow sip of her wine and sighed like I was a toddler interrupting a dinner party. She told me to lower my voice. She explained that David's family drove European imports and Chloe could not marry into Boston high society while driving a rusted Honda. She said they just borrowed my good credit because my father was between consulting contracts. She promised they would make the monthly payments and told me I was overreacting over a few pieces of paper. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She truly believed stealing my identity was a reasonable parenting decision. I told them they had 24 hours to return the car to the dealership or transfer the loan into their own names. My father stood up. The wooden chair scraped loud against the hardwood floor. He walked over and stood inches from my face. He pointed a finger at my chest and told me I would do no such thing. He said if I dared to report the car stolen or embarrass Chloe in front of David, He would cut me out of the family trust and ruin my reputation with every relative we had. He expected me to shrink. He expected the 18-year-old girl who used to beg for their approval to apologize and walk away. I did not scream. I did not argue. The silence in the kitchen stretched out thick and heavy. I looked at my mother drinking her wine, and my father glaring with his chest puffed out. They viewed me as a line of credit, a disposable asset to fund their desperate climb up the social ladder. I realized right then that reasoning with parasites only gives them more time to feed. I picked up my keys, turned around, and walked out the front door without another word. I let them think they won. I let them believe my silence was submission. But an auditor does not argue with thieves. An auditor gathers evidence. The drive back to New Haven took 42 minutes. I know because I stared at the dashboard clock the entire way. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, but my breathing remained steady. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to pain. What I felt was not pain. It was clarity. The kind of sharp, cold clarity that comes when you realize the people tasked with protecting you are the ones holding the knife. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building. My phone illuminated the dark cabin. A text message from my father. Family dinner tomorrow at 7. David will be there. We need to discuss the rehearsal schedule. Be on time. Do not test my patience. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. He needed to ensure the leash was still securely fastened to my neck. He needed me in the room to play the supportive older sister in front of the man they viewed as their golden ticket. The next evening, I parked my 10-year-old sedan behind the gleaming white Porsche Macan. The red velvet bow was gone, replaced by custom license plates that read Chloe W. She had already claimed the stolen asset as her permanent identity. I walked through the front door. The dining room table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. A roast rested in the center, surrounded by silver serving trays. David sat across from Chloe, wearing a tailored suit and a genuine smile. My father poured a heavy measure of scotch into David's glass, laughing at a joke the young surgeon had just made. My mother fluttered around the table, adjusting napkins and offering compliments. "Evelyn is here," Susan announced. Her voice dripped with artificial warmth. "Come sit, darling." David was just telling us about his latest cardiovascular procedure. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table. David smiled at me. He had kind eyes and a steady demeanor. He belonged to a world of Boston galas and hospital boardrooms. He had no idea he was sitting in a viper pit. "It is good to see you, Evelyn," David said. "Chloe told me you helped finance the Porsche. That was an incredibly generous wedding gift. I told her it was too much, but you know how persuasive your sister can be." I looked at Chloe. She held her fork suspended in midair. Her eyes darted to my father. "It was a family effort," my father interjected smoothly. He raised his scotch glass. "We do whatever it takes to support our girls. Cheers to the happy couple." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. I let the silence stretch. I watched the tension tighten the corners of my mother's mouth. 30 minutes later, David's pager beeped. He checked the screen and stood up apologetically. "I have to take this. It is the chief of surgery. Excuse me for a moment." He stepped out onto the back patio and slid the glass door shut. The moment the latch clicked, the temperature in the dining room plummeted. The smiles vanished. The theater closed. My father reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped inches from my plate. "Sign it," he commanded. I unfolded the paper. It was a typed statement, a legal declaration stating that I willingly authorized the use of my social security number and credit profile to secure the auto loan for Chloe Johansson. It included a clause waiving my right to dispute the transaction with any financial institution or law enforcement agency. They were trying to paper over federal fraud with a homemade contract. "I am not signing a confession to a crime I did not commit," I said. I placed the paper back on the table. My father leaned forward. The veins in his neck pushed against his shirt collar. He slammed his open palm down on the wood. The crystal wine glasses rattled. "You will sign that paper right now," he growled. His voice was low and hard. "You are not going to ruin your sister's future because you are bitter and selfish." "Stealing $80,000 is not a symptom of my selfishness," I replied. "It is a felony. I told you yesterday to return the car. You have ignored me." "Return the car?" Chloe scoffed. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "I already showed it to David's mother. She loves it. If we take it back now, I will look like a fraud. You make 6 figures, Evelyn. Just pay the monthly bill. And by the way, the insurance premium is due next week. You need to put your card on file with the broker. Young drivers with luxury cars get high rates." I stared at my 24-year-old sister. She had just asked the victim of her identity theft to cover the insurance premiums for the stolen property. The audacity was so profound it bordered on clinical delusion. "I am not paying a dime," I said. My father stood up. He loomed over the table, casting a long shadow across the china. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. Every word was a calculated strike. "If you dare to call the bank or breathe a word of this to David, I will destroy you. I will call the managing partners at your accounting firm. I will tell them you have a gambling addiction and you have been stealing from our family accounts to cover your debts. An auditor under investigation for theft loses her license forever. Your career will be over." I kept my face perfectly still. He pressed his advantage, mistaking my silence for fear. "And then I will call the executor of your grandmother's estate. I will invoke the morality clause and have you permanently removed from the inheritance trust. You will lose the house you are trying to buy. You will lose your reputation. But let us talk about what you owe us, Evelyn. I paid your university tuition out of my own pocket. We housed you, fed you, and funded that expensive accounting degree so you could sit in a glass office and judge your own flesh and blood. You think your 6-figure salary is yours alone? It is not. It is a return on our investment. We built your foundation, and this car is simply your contribution back to the family. It is your filial duty. You owe your sister this wedding, and you owe us your credit score. Stop being a selfish child and pay your debts to the people who gave you everything." My mother took a delicate sip of her wine. She did not look at me. She looked at the floral centerpiece. "Just sign the paper, Evelyn," she murmured. "Stop making everything so difficult. Your sister is marrying a prominent doctor. She needs this. You just sit in a cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day. Be a team player for once in your life." I looked at the 3 of them. My father the enforcer, my mother the enabler, my sister the parasite. They did not see me as a human being. They saw me as an ATM, a disposable resource meant to be drained to sustain their illusion of grandeur. They believed the bond of blood gave them an unrestricted license to harvest my life for their gain. They thought the threat of social ruin and lost inheritance would force me back into the obedient mold I had occupied since childhood. They were treating an auditor like a frightened teenager. An auditor does not react to intimidation. An auditor evaluates the leverage. My father assumed his threats were absolute. He assumed I valued my standing in this toxic family more than my own survival. I picked up the forged declaration. I ripped it in half. Then I ripped it again. I let the pieces flutter onto my half-eaten roast. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He took a step toward me. "I am leaving," I said. I stood up and pushed my chair back. It scraped loud against the hardwood floor. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to this family," my father snarled. I picked up my purse. I looked him dead in the eye. "I died in this house a long time ago," I said. "You are just talking to the ghost." I turned and walked out. I did not run. I measured my steps. I kept my spine straight. I walked past the kitchen, past the framed family portraits that did not feature my face, and out into the cool evening air. I unlocked my car and got inside. I locked the doors. I watched the front of the house. David stepped back out onto the patio, oblivious to the war that had just been declared inside. I started the engine. I did not drive to a police station. A police report would trigger a local investigation. My father knew the local police chief. He would spin a story about a confused daughter and a family misunderstanding. The evidence would get buried. I needed federal leverage. I needed a paper trail so undeniable that no amount of small-town influence could erase it. I drove back to my apartment in New Haven. I turned on the lights. I made a pot of black coffee. I opened my laptop and placed it on the kitchen island. My parents thought they had silenced me with their chokehold. They forgot that when you put your hands around someone's throat, you leave your fingerprints everywhere. I logged into my secure terminal. I pulled the initial credit inquiry report. I bypassed the summary and went straight into the raw data logs. I needed the exact timestamps. I needed the IP addresses used to submit the electronic loan application. I needed the routing numbers attached to the down payment. I was going to dissect their financial lives layer by layer. The first battle was over. The execution had just begun. The projection screen displayed a quarterly risk assessment for a mid-sized logistics firm. I sat near the head of the conference table, tapping a silver pen against my legal pad. The managing partner paused his presentation, waiting for my input. I pointed my pen at the third column of the spreadsheet. I told the board they had a $200,000 discrepancy hidden under vague vendor payments. The room went quiet. I explained exactly how the client was using offshore shell companies to artificially inflate their operational expenses. An auditor does not just look at the numbers. An auditor looks at the shadows the numbers cast. My phone vibrated against the polished wood. A local Connecticut number. I ignored it. 30 seconds later, it vibrated again. Standard protocol for collections or emergencies. I excused myself from the boardroom and walked down the glass-walled corridor. The city of New Haven spread out below my window. I answered the call. A woman with a headset-quality voice spoke. She asked to verify my date of birth and the last 4 digits of my social security number. I provided them to confirm the caller identity. She announced herself as a representative of Apex Auto Financial. She informed me that the first monthly payment on a Porsche Macan was exactly 14 days past due. A late fee had been applied. If the balance remained unpaid for another 16 days, the account would enter default status and the recovery division would be dispatched to secure the asset. I stood perfectly still. The cold glass of the window pressed against my shoulder. My parents had sworn they would manage the monthly installments. They had used that promise to justify the initial theft. 3 weeks had passed, and they had already defaulted. They did not just steal my credit profile. They were actively destroying it by treating the loan like a gift card with a zero balance. I asked the representative for the exact past due amount, $890. I asked her if any partial payments had been attempted. She confirmed the account had zero activity since origination. I thanked her and ended the call. I dialed my father's cell phone. It rang 4 times before the line connected. A woman answered, but it was not my father. The background noise sounded like a high-end retail space. Soft classical music played beneath the chatter of multiple women. The unmistakable clinking of champagne flutes echoed through the speaker. A voice in the distance praised the intricate lace detailing of a train. "Evelyn," Chloe said. Her voice carried a lazy, entitled drawl. Dad left his phone on the sofa. "What do you want?" I asked her why the auto finance company was calling me about a delinquent payment. Chloe sighed, a heavy, dramatic breath meant to convey deep annoyance. She told a sales associate to pin the waist tighter on the left side. "We are at the Vera Wang boutique in Manhattan," Chloe said. "Dad gave me his credit card for the fitting. I am standing on a pedestal wearing a $10,000 silk gown. I do not have time to talk about car bills." I kept my voice low and steady. I told her the loan was past due. I told her the bank was threatening repossession. "You make 6 figures a year, Evelyn," Chloe scoffed. Her tone dripped with condescension. "Just pay the damn bill. It is only a few $100. "You are ruining my fitting with this negative energy. David's mother is sitting right outside the dressing room, and I cannot have her seeing me stressed." I asked her if she understood the legal consequences of defaulting on a fraudulent loan. Chloe laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Nobody is going to jail over a late car payment, Evelyn. Stop being so dramatic. Dad said you would probably throw a tantrum. Just put your checking account on auto pay and leave us alone. We are busy. She ended the call. The dial tone hummed against my ear. She did not express a single ounce of guilt. She demanded I subsidize the theft. They had stolen my identity to purchase a luxury vehicle, and now they expected me to maintain it so she could continue playing the role of a wealthy bride. I lowered the phone. A sharp metallic taste coated my tongue. The anger did not make me want to shout. It made me want to dissect them. I walked back into the boardroom. I gathered my laptop and my legal pad. I told the managing partner I had a personal emergency requiring my immediate attention. I walked to my private cubicle and closed the door. I pulled the blinds shut. My parents believed they were dealing with a compliant daughter who would eventually bow to family pressure to avoid a scandal. They failed to realize the specific nature of my profession. They viewed a bank loan as a magic trick. They thought money simply appeared when you signed a digital pad. I view a bank loan as a forensic trail. I booted up my secure terminal. I bypassed the standard consumer credit portals and logged directly into a commercial background screening database used by our firm to verify corporate executives. I entered my own credentials. I paid the access fee. The raw data populated across my dual monitors. I did not want the summary. I wanted the origin files. I isolated the Apex Auto Financial Inquiry. I pulled the dealer submission package. The screen filled with scanned documents. I opened the primary loan application. My name, my date of birth, my social security number. But the employment history listed me as an independent consultant. The stated income was artificially inflated by $40,000. I opened the income verification attachment, a W-2 form. It was a flawless copy of my actual tax document from 2 years ago. The exact form I had accidentally left in a moving box in my childhood bedroom when I transitioned to my new apartment. My father had dug through my personal belongings, retrieved a sensitive federal document, and scanned it into his computer. The level of premeditation turned my stomach. He had kept a file on me. He had waited for the right moment to deploy it. I moved to the signature page. A digital DocuSign stamp rested on the bottom line. I pulled the metadata from the electronic signature block. Electronic signatures capture timestamps and IP addresses to ensure legal binding. They leave a digital fingerprint on every executed contract. The IP address resolved to a residential Comcast network located in Harlan, Connecticut, my parents' physical address. The timestamp matched a Sunday afternoon when I was physically sitting in a coffee shop in New Haven, paying for lattes with my own debit card. I possessed the bank statements to prove my geographical location at the exact minute the contract was signed. I downloaded the metadata. I exported the forged W-2. I captured the network routing logs. This was no longer a family dispute over a car. This was identity theft. This was wire fraud. This was the transmission of fraudulent financial documents across state lines. These were federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. I sat back in my chair. The soft glow of the monitors illuminated the dark office. My father had threatened to ruin my career if I spoke out. He believed his leverage was absolute. He thought the fear of a ruined reputation would keep me silent. He handed me the exact weapon required to dismantle his life. The evidence was undeniable. It was documented, verified, and digitally sealed. I opened a new encrypted folder on my desktop. I named it the Harlan file. I dragged the PDF documents into the vault. I reached for my coffee mug. Before my fingers touched the ceramic handle, a high-pitched chime echoed from my laptop speakers. A priority alert from my credit monitoring service. I clicked the notification banner. The screen refreshed. A new hard inquiry had just registered on my credit file. Then a second inquiry appeared. Then a third. My heart hammered against my ribs. I refreshed the page. The inquiries were not for auto loans. They were applications for high-limit travel reward credit cards. 2 of them had already been instantly approved. I stared at the approval amounts. $15,000. $20,000. My parents were not just ignoring the car payment. They were actively expanding the fraud. They were at a luxury bridal boutique in Manhattan right now. I watched a fourth inquiry hit the dashboard. A charge account for a luxury country club catering service. They were using my stolen identity to finance the entire wedding. I hovered my mouse over the freeze account button. One click would lock my credit profile and stop the bleeding. I moved my hand away from the mouse. I did not freeze the accounts. Freezing the accounts would alert them. It would stop the spending, but it would also stop the evidence gathering. If they wanted to seal their own fate, I was going to hand them the pen. The valet at the Oak Ridge Country Club wore a crisp white uniform and white gloves. He approached my 10-year-old sedan with practiced neutrality, handing me a ticket before slipping behind the wheel. I stood on the circular driveway and looked up at the stone facade of the clubhouse. Ivy crawled up the pillars. Warm yellow light poured from the arched windows of the grand ballroom. My credit profile was currently funding every brick of the evening. I walked through the mahogany double doors and into the foyer. The scent of imported white peonies and roasted tenderloin hung heavy in the air. A string quartet played a soft classical arrangement in the corner. The venue required a $20,000 minimum for weekend events. I knew that because I possessed the digital receipt detailing the exact minute my stolen identity authorized the charge. A hostess, holding a leather-bound seating chart, asked for my name. She ran her finger down the list, flipped to the second page, and offered a tight, sympathetic smile. She escorted me past the sweeping centerpieces, past the head table draped in ivory silk, and led me to the far back corner of the room. Table 18. It sat inches from the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Every 3 minutes, a waiter pushed through, sending a gust of cold air and the harsh clatter of industrial dishwashers over our table. My dining companions consisted of a great-aunt who had not spoken to my father in a decade, and 2 distant cousins who spent the appetizer course staring at their phones. I took my seat and folded the linen napkin over my lap. I did not complain. The vantage point offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. At the head table, my parents held court. Susan wore an emerald green evening gown that caught the chandelier light with every movement. Richard sported a bespoke tuxedo, the fabric rich and impeccably tailored. They mirrored the image of generational wealth, laughing with the ease of people who had never checked a price tag. Seated directly across from them was David's family. David looked handsome in a dark suit, his hand resting gently over Chloe's, but my focus shifted immediately to the woman sitting next to him. Eleanor Whitmore. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a simple strand of pearls. As a retired Superior Court judge, her posture lacked the eager, leaning-in desperation my parents displayed. She sat perfectly straight. She listened to Richard tell a story, her head tilted slightly, her eyes scanning his face. She did not nod along. She did not offer filler laughs. She merely absorbed the information. People who spend 30 years on the bench develop an instinct for perjury. They learn to separate the authentic from the performative. I watched Eleanor take a slow sip of sparkling water. She was already cataloging the inconsistencies. When the main course plates were cleared, the room grew quiet. A waiter tapped a spoon against a crystal glass. Richard stood up. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket and beamed at the crowd. "Welcome, everyone!" He projected his voice effortlessly across the banquet hall. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate 2 remarkable young people, Chloe, my beautiful daughter, and David, the man we are so proud to welcome into our family." A murmur of polite applause rippled through the tables. "David's family represents a legacy of excellence in Boston," Richard continued, raising his champagne flute. "And we believe in starting a marriage on the right foundation. That is why Susan and I decided to present the couple with an early wedding gift, a token to ensure they drive into their future with the safety and elegance they deserve. The Porsche Macan parked out front is for you, David. Welcome to the family." The room erupted into applause. Guests smiled and clapped. David looked genuinely surprised, shaking his head and mouthing a humble thank you across the table. Susan placed a hand over her heart, playing the role of the generous matriarch to perfection. Eleanor did not clap. She picked up her water glass, took a slow sip, and leaned slightly toward Richard. "That is an incredibly generous gift, Richard," Eleanor said, her voice calm and conversational. "The supply chain shortages have made securing European luxury vehicles nearly impossible this quarter." "Did you have to finance it through a secondary broker, or did the local dealership manage to pull a miracle at standard market rates?" Richard faltered. The gleaming smile on his face froze. He was a man who understood social optics, but he did not understand the granular mechanics of auto financing. "Oh, we handled it directly through the dealer," Richard stammered, his voice losing its projected confidence. "Standard rates, of course, nothing we could not manage." Eleanor tilted her head, her eyes locked onto his. "Fascinating," Eleanor replied. "Apex Auto Financial usually underwrites the loans for that specific dealership, and their standard rate on luxury imports requires an immaculate credit history and a multi-day corporate review. You must have remarkable liquidity to push that through in a single weekend." Richard swallowed hard. The veins in his neck pulsed. Susan rigidly stared at her plate, unwilling to make eye contact with anyone at the table. Eleanor did not press him further. She did not need to. She picked up her cloth napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth, and set it down. Her gaze moved from the panicked sweat forming on my father's brow to the tight, triumphant smirk on my sister's face. Then slowly, Eleanor turned her head. Her eyes swept past the centerpieces, past the middle rows, until they landed on table 18. She looked at me, sitting in the shadows of the kitchen doors. We held eye contact for 2 seconds. She recognized exactly whose immaculate credit history had been leveraged to buy that car. The toast concluded. The string quartet resumed playing. Guests stood to mingle, carrying their drinks between tables. Chloe stood up from the head table. She smoothed the front of her designer silk dress. She whispered something to David, patted his shoulder, and began walking across the room. She did not take the perimeter route. She walked straight down the center aisle, ensuring every guest had a clear view of the bride-to-be. She held a glass of champagne in one hand. As she approached the back of the room, her smile tightened into a weapon. She stopped at table 18. The distant cousins stopped typing on their phones and looked up. Chloe did not lower her voice. She calibrated her volume specifically to Carrie. She wanted the nearby tables to hear. She wanted David's family, seated just 20 feet away, to witness her put the difficult older sister in her place. "Thank you for the discount bedding set, Evelyn," Chloe said. The music seemed to dip. The conversations at the adjacent tables faltered. "I know you are jealous I snagged a prominent doctor and got a luxury car," Chloe continued, her tone dripping with rehearsed condescension. "But try not to wear your bitterness so openly. Sitting back here pouting is just embarrassing for you." The silence spread outward like a spill. The clinking of silverware ceased. At table 14, a woman lowered her fork. David turned in his chair, his brow furrowed in confusion, clearly hearing the harsh edge in his fiancée's voice. Richard noticed the shift in the room and took a step forward, his jaw clenching. Chloe stood tall, waiting for my reaction. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to drop my gaze, apologize quietly, or storm out of the room in tears. She wanted the spectacle. She wanted to prove to her future mother-in-law that I was the unstable, envious outcast of the family. I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I did not shift in my seat. I looked at the imported silk of her dress. I thought about the routing numbers, the forged W-2, the timestamps, and the federal wire fraud statutes. I offered her a gentle, serene smile. "I hope you will always cherish everything I have contributed to this wedding," I replied softly. Chloe frowned. The response lacked the anger she needed to fuel her narrative. It was polite, measured, and entirely unbothered. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but the absolute calm in my expression made her hesitate. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and looked past her. Eleanor Whitmore was still watching us. The retired judge tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in sharp, silent calculation. The trap was fully set. The guests had finished their meals. The final night of their fraudulent empire was drawing to a close. The restroom smelled of lavender and industrial bleach. I walked past the row of gilded mirrors, pushed open the heavy wooden door of the furthest stall, and engaged the brass lock. The classical music from the rehearsal dinner became a muffled, distant thrum through the thick walls. I pulled my phone from my clutch. The screen glared in the dim, enclosed space. I bypassed my personal applications and opened my secure cloud drive. The folder labeled the Harlan file sat at the top of the directory. I selected the forged tax documents, the network routing logs, the dealer application package, and the electronic signature metadata. I opened a new email draft. I had not waited until the night before the wedding to contact the authorities. Submitting a cold tip to a federal website takes months to process. But a senior auditor does not use the public hotline. I had sent the forensic dossier directly to a lead investigator at the Economic Crimes Division I worked with on a corporate embezzlement case last year. I called in a professional favor and handed him a fully documented felony tied up with a neat bow. Federal warrants take time to secure, but they move much faster when the investigating agent already has a flawless paper trail sitting on his desk. I opened my encrypted inbox. A new message from my contact sat at the top. The federal seizure warrant was officially signed by a judge that afternoon. The asset recovery team was scheduled to arrive at the Oak Ridge Country Club tomorrow at exactly 2 p.m. The trap was not just set, it was already springing shut. I washed my hands in the marble sink, dried them on a thick cotton towel, and walked back out into the dining room to finish my sparkling water. The next afternoon, the sun beat down on the Connecticut suburbs with sharp clarity. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, a pristine day for a high society wedding. I drove my old sedan back up the winding tree-lined driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The venue had transformed overnight. The valet staff had doubled in size, jogging between vehicles in starched white uniforms. Black SUVs and imported luxury sedans lined the entrance, reflecting the afternoon sun. I handed my keys to a young attendant and walked toward the expansive back lawn where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. The scale of the event was staggering. 200 white wooden chairs sat in perfectly aligned rows across the manicured grass. A towering floral arch, constructed of imported white roses, peonies, and rare orchids, stood at the end of the aisle. A string quartet tuned their instruments under a white canvas canopy, the sharp notes of the violins cutting through the warm breeze. Waiters circulated with silver trays of sparkling water and champagne flutes. Every single detail, from the expensive floral arrangements to the custom-printed programs resting on each seat, had been financed by the bleeding out of my credit score. I took a seat in the second-to-last row. The guests poured in. Women in designer silk dresses and men in tailored summer suits filled the chairs. The Boston contingent, David's family, and their elite circle of friends occupied the entire left side of the aisle. They moved with the quiet, effortless confidence of established wealth. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the front row. She wore a structured navy suit. Her posture remained impeccably straight. She did not chatter or gossip with the people beside her. She observed. After our silent exchange at the rehearsal dinner, I knew she was calculating the variables, waiting for the equation to balance. On the right side of the aisle, my parents held court. Richard wore a custom tuxedo. He shook hands with country club board members, laughing loudly, projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch giving away his favored daughter. Susan fluttered between the rows, adjusting the floral arrangements, accepting compliments on her gown, basking in the glow of the attention she craved so desperately. Near the entrance of the garden path, strategically parked where every arriving guest was forced to admire it, sat the white Porsche Macan. The giant red velvet bow had been placed back on the hood for the wedding day photographs. Chloe and David were finishing their pre-ceremony portrait session. Chloe looked radiant in a silk gown with a cathedral-length train. She leaned against the driver's side door of the stolen vehicle, smiling brilliantly for the photographer. David stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, oblivious that the metal beneath their hands was active state evidence. A wedding coordinator with a headset scurried past, herding the bridal party into position, The string quartet transitioned from light classical background music to a slow, sweeping processional piece. The guests took their seats. The low murmur of conversation faded into a reverent silence. The officiant, a distinguished man with silver hair and a dark suit, took his place beneath the floral arch. The groomsmen and bridesmaids began their synchronized march down the white runner. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It was the exact aesthetic my parents had sacrificed my future to achieve. They had successfully purchased their way into the upper echelon, and the transaction was minutes away from being finalized. I sat in the back row, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My phone vibrated once in my purse. I did not check it. The gears were already turning. The music swelled, signaling the bride's imminent arrival. The guests rose to their feet in unison. Richard stood at the top of the aisle, offering his arm to Chloe. Susan pressed a lace handkerchief to her eye. The picture of flawless suburban perfection. Then a sound tore through the pristine silence. It was not the gentle chime of a cell phone or the cry of a child. It was the harsh, grinding roar of a heavy-duty diesel engine. The guests turned their heads toward the clubhouse. The string quartet faltered, the cellist dragging a dissonant, screeching note across the strings. A flatbed tow truck, painted bright yellow with industrial caution stripes, rumbled down the cobblestone path leading directly to the garden. The heavy tires crushed the manicured edges of the lawn, spitting gravel onto the walkway. Right behind the tow truck, moving in tight formation, came two county sheriff's cruisers. Their light bars flashed a rapid sequence of red and blue, casting harsh-colored shadows across the terrified faces of the wedding guests. They did not use their sirens, but the visual assault was overwhelming. The vehicles did not stop at the perimeter. They drove directly onto the grass, halting mere feet from the white Porsche Macan. The music ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the idling diesel engine of the tow truck. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the lead cruiser. They did not look at the bride. They did not look at the 200 guests. Their faces were carved from stone. They walked with terrifying purpose straight toward the luxury vehicle. One officer unclipped a clipboard from his belt. The other withdrew a stack of bright, neon orange stickers. Without a word of explanation, the second officer slapped the first orange sticker directly onto the driver's side window of the Porsche. The bold black letters printed across the sticker were visible from the back row. Evidence seizure. The diesel engine of the tow truck idled with a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The garden remained perfectly still. 200 guests held their breath. The officiant stood frozen at the altar with his script binder half open. The string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, leaving a dissonant hum hanging in the warm afternoon breeze. My father broke the paralysis. Richard stepped off the white runner and marched across the manicured grass. He threw his shoulders back. He adjusted his custom tuxedo jacket. He operated on the assumption that authority always deferred to him in his own town. He approached the lead officer with a tight, forced smile that did not reach his eyes. "Excuse me, gentlemen," my father said. His voice projected across the lawn, honed by years of boardroom presentations. "You have made a wrong turn. This is a private event at a private club. I suggest you remove that vehicle and your cruisers before I call the chief of police." The lead officer did not smile back. He did not look intimidated by the tuxedo or the expensive floral arrangements. He rested his hand on his utility belt and looked directly into my father's face. "Are you Richard Johansson?" the officer asked. "I am," my father replied, "and I am telling you to take that sticker off my property." The officer unclipped a radio microphone from his shoulder. He did not lower his voice. He spoke with the flat mechanical precision of a man who dismantles arrogant men for a living. "Richard Johansson, this vehicle is no longer your property," the officer stated loudly. "It is currently evidence of a federal felony. Step away from the vehicle immediately or you will be placed in handcuffs in front of your guests." The words echoed off the stone facade of the clubhouse. Fraud. Identity theft. The syllables hung in the warm air, cutting through the scent of imported roses. At the front of the aisle, my mother stumbled. Susan caught herself against a white wooden chair. Her knuckles turned stark white against the painted wood. She looked around the crowd with wild, darting eyes, searching for a friendly face to validate her outrage. The women from her country club circle averted their gazes. The polite smiles of the high society guests dissolved into tight lines of judgment. Chloe reacted differently. The illusion she spent a year constructing was being towed away right in front of her future in-laws. She dropped her bridal bouquet. The expensive white peonies scattered across the grass, getting crushed under her heels. She lifted the heavy skirt of her silk gown and ran toward the driveway.
"You cannot take it!"
Chloe screamed. Her voice cracked, shattering the serene wedding atmosphere.
"That is my wedding gift! Leave it alone!"
She lunged toward the tow truck driver, who was currently securing thick metal chains to the front axle of the Porsche. The second police officer stepped into her path, holding up a rigid palm.
"Ma'am, step back,"
the officer commanded.
"Do not interfere with the federal seizure."
Chloe ignored him. She tried to push past his arm, her face flushed and streaked with dark mascara. She clawed at the air, reaching for the gleaming white hood of the car. David ran down the aisle and grabbed her by the waist, pulling her backward. He wrapped his arms around her, pinning her hands to her sides. He looked at the police officers with wide, unblinking eyes. He looked at the neon orange evidence sticker slapped across the driver's side window.
"What is going on here?"
David asked. His voice betrayed a deep, rising panic. He loosened his grip on Chloe and took a step away from her.
"Richard, what did you do?"
My father ignored his future son-in-law. Richard stepped closer to the lead officer, lowering his voice to a harsh, desperate whisper. He tried to contain the blast radius. He tried to negotiate. "Listen to me," my father hissed. "I know the mayor. I know the county commissioner. We can sort out this paperwork on Monday morning. Name your price for the bond. I will write a check right now. Just drive those trucks out of here and let my daughter get married." An auditor knows that bribery only works in the shadows. When you attempt it under the glare of red and blue police lights in front of 200 witnesses, you only accelerate your own demise. The officer did not even blink. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his cruiser and shoved it firmly against my father's chest. "You cannot write a check to wave away federal wire fraud, Mr. Johansson," the officer replied, his voice cutting through the silent lawn. "Especially not a check tied to the same stolen identity you used to buy that car. You and Susan Johansson are hereby served with a criminal summons. You are required to surrender yourselves for formal processing on Monday morning." The officer turned his head and looked directly at Susan, who was now trembling near the floral arch. "Susan Johansson," the officer commanded, "step forward and sign the receipt of this federal summons. Do not make me come get you." The massacre was absolute. The surgical destruction of their social standing happened in broad daylight. The guests began to whisper. The sound swelled from a low murmur to an undeniable hum of scandalized conversation. The Boston elite, sitting on the left side of the aisle, leaned away from the Johansson family. They pulled their expensive coats tighter around their shoulders as if fraud was a contagious disease. My mother took a shaky step forward. She could not maintain her posture. Her shoulders slumped. She looked like a deflated balloon. She took a pen from the officer with trembling fingers and signed her name on the clipboard. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes glued to the grass. My father stood frozen, holding the manila envelope. The veins in his forehead pulsed. His jaw worked silently, chewing on words he could no longer afford to speak. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of lies to convince the world he belonged in the upper class. He traded my future to buy the bricks. Now the fortress was collapsing, crushing him under the weight of his own arrogance. The tow truck driver engaged the hydraulic winch. The heavy metal gears ground together, creating a terrible mechanical screech. The white Porsche tilted upward, its front wheels lifting off the pavement. The giant red velvet bow slipped off the hood and fell into a muddy puddle near the curb. The vehicle was dragged onto the flatbed, securing the physical proof of their crime for transport to an impound lot. In the front row, Eleanor Whitmore stood up. She did not rush. She did not panic. A retired Superior Court judge knows how to command a room simply by moving through it. Eleanor smoothed the front of her tailored navy suit. She stepped out of the pew and walked down the center aisle. The whispering guests fell silent as she passed. She bypassed Chloe, who was currently sobbing against David's chest. She bypassed my mother, who was wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Eleanor stopped directly in front of my father. Richard looked up at her. He tried to summon a reassuring smile. He tried to play the role of the misunderstood patriarch. "Eleanor, it is a misunderstanding," my father stammered. "A clerical error at the bank. You know how these financial institutions operate. We will have it cleared up by tomorrow." Eleanor did not smile. Her eyes swept over the manila envelope in his hand. She looked at the police cruisers pulling out of the driveway with the Porsche in tow. She looked at the neon orange sticker fading into the distance. "I spent 30 years on the bench, Mr. Johansson," Eleanor said. Her voice was cold, measured, and devoid of any sympathy. "Law enforcement agencies do not dispatch tow trucks and serve federal summons at a wedding ceremony for a clerical error. They do it when they have irrefutable forensic evidence." She turned her head and looked at Chloe. The bride was a mess of tangled silk and ruined makeup. "And they do it," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping an octave, "when someone has committed identity theft." "Whose identity did you steal, Richard?" My father swallowed hard. The silence stretched tight. He could not formulate a lie fast enough to satisfy a woman who made a career out of detecting perjury. He opened his mouth, but only a ragged breath escaped. Eleanor did not wait for his answer. She did not need his confession. She possessed an analytical mind, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattered right in front of her. She slowly turned her gaze away from my father. She looked past the rows of white chairs. She looked past the whispering guest. Her eyes found me, sitting in the second-to-last row. I sat perfectly still. My hands remained neatly folded in my lap. I did not look away. I met the gaze of the retired judge with absolute calm. I offered no tears and no apologies. The afternoon sun cast a long shadow across the lawn, highlighting the stark contrast between the frantic, guilty family at the altar and the quiet, composed auditor in the back row. Eleanor stared at me. Her brow furrowed slightly as the final piece of the equation snapped into place. She realized the source of the stolen credit. She realized the origin of the federal evidence. She realized exactly who had triggered the trap. I watched her eyes widen slightly in recognition. The execution was flawless, and she knew it. The connection forged across the rows of white folding chairs lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of a signed confession. Eleanor Whitmore held my gaze with a sharp, calculating stillness. She did not need to ask how the police obtained the digital footprint of the fraud. She saw the answer sitting quietly in the second-to-last row, wearing a tailored navy dress and an expression devoid of panic. Before Eleanor could take a step toward me, the heavy fabric of a cathedral-length train dragged across the grass. Chloe tore down the center aisle. She moved with a frantic, uncoordinated speed. The delicate lace of her Vera Wang gown caught on the edge of a wooden chair, tearing a jagged hole near the hem. She did not notice. Her face was a canvas of ruined cosmetics. Dark streaks of mascara cut across her cheeks, and her perfectly pinned hair had started to unravel, falling in damp strands against her neck. She closed the distance between us and lunged. Her hands darted out, her manicured acrylic nails digging into the fabric of my sleeve. Her grip was tight enough to bruise.
What did you do?
Chloe shrieked. Her voice cracked, hitting a pitch that echoed off the stone walls of the clubhouse.
You ruined my wedding! You waited until today just to humiliate me in front of his family!
I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away. I looked down at her hands clutching my sleeve, then back up to her face. I did not forge a federal document, Chloe, I replied. My tone kept low and even. I simply forwarded the receipt. Her eyes widened, shifting from outrage to a desperate cornered terror. She shook my arm, her knuckles turning white.
Fix it,
she demanded.
Tell them right now!
Go over to that officer and tell him you let Mom and Dad borrow your credit profile. Tell him it was a misunderstanding and you gave them permission. If you do not walk over there right now and drop those charges, you are going to ruin my life. She delivered the demand with the arrogant assumption that I still operated under the family mandate of silent submission. She wanted me to perjure myself to a federal investigator to save her country club reception. More importantly, she had just screened her awareness of the crime to an audience of 200 silent guests. A heavy footstep crunched on the gravel path behind her. Permission for what? David stood at the end of the row. He had followed his bride down the aisle, but he maintained a deliberate 3-foot distance from her. His breathing was shallow. His dark suit jacket hung open. He looked at Chloe's hands gripping my arm. He did not rush forward to comfort her. He analyzed the scene. Behind him, Eleanor Whitmore approached, her stride measured and authoritative. Chloe dropped my arm and spun around. She reached for David, pasting a fragile, trembling smile over her panic. "Babe, it is nothing," Chloe stammered, her voice dropping an octave into a practiced, innocent register. "Evelyn is just being vindictive. My parents had a mix-up with some banking paperwork and she called the police to cause a scene because she is jealous. Tell her to tell the truth." David did not take her hand. He kept his arms rigid at his sides. He looked past his fiancée and focused his gaze directly on me. "Evelyn," David said, his voice tight with suppressed dread. "What exactly did your parents borrow?" The time for silent observation had concluded. I reached down and unzipped my leather tote bag. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy dossier bound by a black metal clip. It was not a handful of loose papers. It was a structured forensic audit. The front cover bore the printed logo of the County Economic Crimes Division and the official seal of the Automotive Finance Fraud Department. I did not hand the dossier to David. A cardiothoracic surgeon understands anatomy. A retired superior court judge understands evidence. I turned and offered the heavy stack of paper to Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor accepted the file. She did not hesitate. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the cover. I looked back at David. I kept my voice conversational, stripping away any trace of malice or triumph. An auditor delivers facts. The facts are lethal enough on their own. The white Porsche currently sitting on a police flatbed was purchased using my Social Security number and a forged copy of my tax returns, I said. I did not grant permission. I discovered the theft when my own mortgage application was denied due to a ruined credit score. When I confronted your future father-in-law, he threatened to destroy my career and sever my inheritance if I reported the crime. Chloe gasped an exaggerated theatrical intake of breath.
"She is lying, David! She is making this all up to ruin our day!"
Eleanor turned the first page of the dossier. The crisp rustle of thick paper sounded remarkably loud in the quiet garden. She reviewed the dealer submission package. She noted the discrepancy between the stated income and the attached tax forms. 30 years of presiding over civil and criminal dockets had trained her to process complex financial data in seconds. She saw the fraudulent architecture holding up the entire wedding. Tab 2 outlines the electronic signature metadata. I continued ignoring my sister entirely. The loan contract was executed from the residential network router at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon while bank records prove I was physically 30 miles away. Eleanor flipped to the second tab. Her eyes scanned the printed IP logs, the timestamps, the geolocation data. Her expression remained impassive, but her posture straightened. She was shifting from wedding guest back to the bench. David took a slow step away from Chloe. The confusion in his eyes was rapidly burning away, leaving behind a stark, horrifying clarity. David was a man of science. He relied on empirical evidence to make life and death decisions in the operating room. He was applying that same rigorous logic to the woman standing in front of him. The math did not lie. The lavish gifts, the sudden influx of cash, the desperate need to impress his parents. The puzzle pieces snapped into a clear picture. He turned his head toward the front of the venue, where Richard and Susan were currently answering questions from the second police officer. "The deposit for this country club?" David started, his words coming out in a disjointed rhythm. "Richard told me he wired the venue deposit from his consulting firm account. He wired it from a Chase Sapphire Rewards card opened in my name 14 days ago," I corrected. "The balance is currently maxed out at $45,000. The catering, the imported floral arch, the string quartet. Every single element of this afternoon was financed through synthetic identity theft. The credit inquiry logs are located behind tab 4. Eleanor turned to the fourth section. She traced a manicured fingernail down the column of unauthorized credit pulls. She flipped another page, finding the itemized receipts for the Vera Wang bridal fitting. Chloe lunged forward. She reached out to slap the folder out of Eleanor's hands. "Give me that fake garbage!" David intercepted her. He did not grab her wrist, but he stepped firmly between Chloe and his mother, using his body as a physical barrier.
Do not touch her,
David commanded. The warmth had vanished from his voice. It was replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. Chloe shrank back, hitting the edge of a folding chair. Tears began to flow freely now, but they were no longer a weapon. They were the desperate reaction of a cornered animal, realizing the trap had sprung shut. She looked at David, her lips trembling.
I did not know.
Chloe pleaded.
I swear, David, I thought my dad paid for it.
I did not know they used her name. Eleanor closed the dossier. The heavy cardboard cover slapped shut with a definitive thud. She took her glasses off and let them hang from the silver chain around her neck. She looked at the bride standing before her. "Do not insult my intelligence, young woman," Eleanor said. Her tone was quiet, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that cut through the garden air. "A minute ago, you demanded your sister lie to a federal officer to cover up a mix-up. Innocent people do not ask victims of fraud to drop charges. Accomplices do." Chloe opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. The remaining guests seated in the nearby rows were watching the exchange with rapt attention. No one whispered. No one moved. The string quartet members sat frozen, holding their instruments like shields. The officiant had quietly stepped off the altar, retreating into the clubhouse shadows. The elite social circle of Boston and the country club members of Connecticut were bearing witness to a real-time forensic dissection. Eleanor turned her attention back to the dossier in her hands. She tapped her fingers against the black binder clip. She looked across the lawn toward Richard Johansson, who was currently being instructed to place his hands on the hood of the patrol cruiser. She watched Susan weep onto the manicured grass. Then Eleanor looked at me. The retired judge evaluated the woman who had sat silently in the back row, enduring insults about cheap betting while holding a loaded gun under the table. "This is an airtight grand jury referral," Eleanor stated. "The documentation is flawless. The chain of custody on these digital records leaves zero room for a defense attorney to maneuver. They committed multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, and they used the proceeds to put on a show for my family." She handed the dossier back to me. Our fingers brushed against the thick cardboard. "You executed this perfectly," Eleanor added. The faintest hint of professional respect flickered in her eyes. "You waited until the exact moment they had maximum exposure." I slipped the file back into my leather tote. I zipped it shut. "I focus on advancing the plot," I replied smoothly. "An auditor calculates the peak moment of liability." Eleanor nodded once, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. She turned her back on Chloe without another word. She faced her son. David stood rigid, staring at the woman he had almost married. The designer dress, the flawless hair, the curated smile. It was all a facade purchased with stolen resources. "David," Eleanor said, her voice projecting across the lawn. "We are leaving." The command carried the weight of a final gavel strike. It did not invite discussion. It did not leave room for negotiation. The trial was over, and the verdict had been delivered. The mahogany doors of the Hartford Federal Courthouse swung shut with a heavy thud, sealing the room. I sat in the gallery 2 rows behind the defense table. My father stood before the judge. His bespoke tuxedo from the wedding day was replaced by a discount gray suit that hung loose on his shoulders. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his shoulders hunched forward. The federal magistrate did not care about country club memberships or local social standing. The judge cared about the paper trail. The exact paper trail I had meticulously packaged and delivered. The prosecutor outlined the wire fraud and synthetic identity theft with surgical precision. Richard and Susan Johansson stood side by side. Susan kept her head bowed. She clutched a damp tissue in her hands, occasionally dabbing her eyes, waiting for the sympathy that usually followed her tears. The sympathy never came. The judge delivered the sentence. They avoided federal prison time due to prison overcrowding and their lack of prior criminal history, but the alternative was a different kind of cage. The judge handed down 5 years of strict supervised probation. The court ordered full restitution to the financial institutions for the stolen $80,000. Furthermore, the judge mandated 2,000 hours of community service for each of them. The gavel struck the sound block. A sharp crack echoed through the high ceilings. That single sound officially branded them as convicted felons. The financial fallout moved faster than the legal proceedings. The banks demanded their money. The $45,000 in credit card charges used to fund the phantom wedding required immediate payment. The Oak Ridge Country Club sued for breach of contract over the canceled reception. My parents filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy within the month. The court-appointed trustee liquidated their assets. 6 weeks later, a bank representative hammered a wooden foreclosure sign into the manicured front lawn of the pristine Connecticut colonial house. The neighbors watched from their porches. The women from my mother's social circle stood on their driveways, holding their morning coffee, watching a moving crew carry the heavy mahogany dining table out the front door. The same table where my father had threatened to destroy my career. The movers loaded the fine china, the crystal glasses, and the imported rugs into a rented truck. My parents relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a lower-income neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Their new building faced a loud intersection, vibrating every time a commercial truck drove past. My father lost his remaining consulting contracts. No corporate client hires a convicted fraudster to manage their finances. He took a job working the overnight shift at a local distribution warehouse, scanning barcodes from midnight until dawn. My mother spent her weekends wearing an orange safety vest, picking up litter along the shoulder of Interstate 91 to fulfill her community service hours. The highway drivers sped past her, blowing dust and exhaust fumes into her face. Chloe faced a different kind of ruin. The Whitmore family excised her from their lives with ruthless efficiency. David did not offer a tearful goodbye. He packed his belongings while she was out of the apartment and left a typed letter from his family attorney on the kitchen counter. The letter mandated 0 future contact. The prestigious Boston family treated her like a toxic liability and erased her from their social registry. Without my stolen credit profile and without David's family wealth, Chloe hit a concrete wall. She could not afford her luxury apartment. She could not afford the designer clothes. She sold her Vera Wang wedding dress to a local consignment shop for a fraction of its retail value. With nowhere else to go, she moved into the tiny second bedroom of my parents' new apartment. I saw her one final time in late November. I had to drive back to the county clerk office to sign the final affidavit clearing my credit report. On the way out of town, I stopped at a local cafe. The exact same cafe she used to complain about during our family dinners, calling it cheap and beneath her standards. I pushed the glass door open. The brass bell above the frame chimed. I walked to the counter. Chloe stood behind the register. She wore a green canvas apron over a faded t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot. The 4-carat diamond engagement ring was gone, leaving a pale indentation on her finger. Her acrylic nails were chipped. She held a damp rag in her hand. She looked up to take my order and froze. The silence stretched between us. The espresso machine hissed in the background. She looked at my tailored wool coat. She looked at my leather briefcase. She looked down at her own stained apron. She opened her mouth. Her lower lip trembled. A sharp breath hitched in her throat. I saw the familiar entitlement flash in her eyes, a desperate urge to blame me for her uniform and her minimum wage shift. But the spark quickly died, replaced by the exhausting reality of her new life. She had no leverage. She had no audience to perform for. She was just a barista staring at a paying customer. "A black coffee, please," I said. My voice held no anger. It held no pity. It was the flat, professional tone you use with a stranger. She punched the order into the screen. Her fingers moved slow. She filled a paper cup and pushed it across the counter. She did not ask for my money. I placed a $5 bill next to the register and walked out. I did not look back. My own life moved upward with quiet momentum. The police reports and the court judgments served as undeniable proof for the credit bureaus. The fraudulent auto loan vanished from my file. The maxed-out credit cards were scrubbed from my history. My credit score climbed back into the high 700s within 2 months. Back in New Haven, the managing partner of my accounting firm called me into the executive boardroom. He had reviewed my quarterly performance. He noted the precision I used to uncover the offshore shell companies for our logistics client. He did not know I had applied those same forensic skills to dismantle my own family. But he recognized the results. He offered me the position of risk audit manager. It came with a corner office, a heavy oak desk, and a substantial salary increase. I accepted the role. I packed my belongings from the open cubicle and moved into an office with a door that locked. In early December, I sat across from a real estate attorney and signed a stack of closing documents. The bank approved my mortgage application in less than 24 hours. I purchased a restored stone house sitting on 3 acres of land in a quiet town, 200 miles away from Connecticut. It featured hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a large kitchen bathed in natural light. It was a fortress built on honest labor. The first snow of the year fell on a Sunday morning. I stood in my new kitchen, holding a warm ceramic mug. The house was perfectly silent. I walked to the front door to check the mail. Inside the metal box rested a single envelope. The return address belonged to the cramped apartment building where my parents now lived. The handwriting belonged to my mother. I walked back into the kitchen and slid my finger under the paper flap. I unfolded the lined notebook paper. Evelyn, we lost the house. Your father is working nights. Chloe cries all day. I know you are angry, but we are still a family. Please call me. We need help. I read the words. I studied the ink. 6 months ago, a letter like this would have triggered a deep, desperate guilt. I would have drained my savings to rescue them. I would have sacrificed my own stability to buy their temporary affection. I looked around my quiet, sunlit kitchen. I thought about the white Porsche being towed off the manicured grass. I thought about the federal judge handing down the sentence. I thought about the undeniable fact that they chose to steal my identity because they believed I was too weak to fight back. Family does not forge your signature to fund their vanity. Family does not threaten to destroy your career to cover up their crimes. I walked over to the stainless steel trash can. I did not tear the letter into dramatic pieces. I did not burn it in the sink. I simply let the paper slip from my fingers. It fluttered down into the dark bin, landing next to the discarded coffee grounds. I did not reply. I did not call. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop to begin my day. The ultimate execution does not require a shouting match or a public spectacle. The most devastating punishment you can inflict on a parasite is to permanently remove their access to the host. You let them watch from a distance as you build a beautiful, brilliant life using the exact resources they tried to drain. I took a sip of my coffee. The flavor was rich and dark. My name is Evelyn. I am a risk audit manager, and my ledger is finally balanced. If my story of shutting down my family's fraudulent empire resonated with you, I want you to remember one thing. Boundaries are not a betrayal. They are your survival. You do not owe your sanity or your financial future to people who treat you like an ATM. Let me know down in the comments exactly how you took your power back from a toxic relative. Hit that like button, subscribe to Sweet Life Drama for more stories about people who stop apologizing and start fighting back, and I will see you in the next video.